And that's the first test for the Gospels, it seems to me. We have to find out, are the Gospels written early enough so that the people who say they wrote them could actually have been there to see what they say they saw? Make sense? So here we have the ministry of Jesus, 30 to 33 AD, and we have the first place that the church comes together and says, okay, these are the reliable eyewitness accounts you guys can trust. That's not the Council of Nicaea, that's the Council of Laodicea. Not until 363 AD does anybody say, these are the Gospels we can trust. What could have happened between those 330 years? A lot of time. What if the Gospels were actually written late, like much closer to the time of the council than they were to the time of the event? You shouldn't trust them, because that means they're written by people who weren't even present at the time of the actual events. If that's the case, if they're written late, you can just chuck that stuff. I would not trust a witness who came to me who was born in 1975 and tried to tell me about a crime that occurred in 1970. You couldn't call her a witness. That's the problem. On the other hand, if we can figure out that these were written earlier, closer to the time of Jesus' actual life, we can at least know that the first criteria has been met. Could they still be lying? Yes. But at least we would know they're lying at the time of the actual event. That'll help us. So we're going to take a look at this right now. How do we know when these were written? When were the Gospels written? Well, I was moved when I read through the Gospels. I'm looking for pieces of circumstantial evidence to build a circumstantial case. It seems to me what's missing in the Gospels, for example, is any description of the destruction of the temple. It'd be wise to include it, it seems to me, because Jesus is going to talk about it. He's going to predict the destruction in Matthew 23. Why wouldn't you include the actual destruction of the temple? It's going to happen in 70 AD when the Roman army comes in and sieges. As a matter of fact, the siege of the city is also missing. They laid siege around the city about 2 or 3 years before the actual destruction of the temple. It'd be a great opportunity for Peter, when he's talking in 1 Peter about suffering, to reference the siege of Jerusalem, where they starved out and eventually collapsed the walls and destroyed the temple. What a great place to talk about suffering. Why is there no mention of the siege anywhere in Scripture? Why is there no mention of Paul's death? Why is he still alive at the book of Acts when it ends? You know he dies around 64, 67. He's martyred in Rome. Why not mention his martyrdom? I mean, you mentioned Stephen's martyrdom in the book of Acts. You mentioned the martyrdom of James, the brother of John. Paul's a pretty big figure in the book of Acts. Why don't you mention his death? Why don't you mention Peter's death? Why don't you mention James, the brother of Jesus? He dies in 61. The 3 biggest players in the book of Acts, and you don't describe their death? Why not? Do you know why, right? Because the book of Acts was written before. The book of Acts is written before all these things actually occurred. That's the most reasonable inference from the evidence, is that Luke is writing sometime before these events had occurred. Now, I'm going to be conservative. I'll put it right here at 60. We don't know how much earlier he actually wrote it, but 60 is fair at least, because it would at least get James is not mentioned. He has 61, so we'll go 1 year before that just to be safe. But we also know that Luke tells us he writes 2 books. What's he write before the book of Acts? The Gospel of Luke. Now we got to predate the Gospel of Luke. That's going to come sometime before the book of Acts. How much earlier? I put it at 53. Why? Because of a couple pieces of internal evidence. First of all, we see that he tells us in the book of Acts, in the first chapter, that he writes something prior to this. And he mentions someone named Theophilus. He'll also mention that name in the first chapter of the Gospel of Luke. So that's the book he's writing prior to this. I think it's fair to assess that way, to examine it that way. But look at what Paul does here in a letter to Timothy, called 1 Timothy. He writes this letter around 63, 64. I'll be honest with you, there are some biblical skeptics who don't even want to attribute this letter to Paul. They'll say this letter to Timothy is not a genuine Pauline letter. I think it is, but there are skeptics. I'll just give you that so you have for fair warning. But here's what Paul writes to Timothy. He says, look, I love this when I first read it, because as a detective, I'm trying to figure out what would the New Testament people call Scripture. Are they just referring to the Old Testament? Is there any internal evidence that tells me what the canon is very early in history? Look at what Paul says, though. He says to Timothy, the elders who direct the affairs of the church are well worthy of double honor, especially those whose work is preaching and teaching. For the Scripture says, oh, that's great. Thanks for saying that, Paul, because now I'm going to figure out, you're about to tell me what you think Scripture is. I want to know. And he says 2 quotes. Do not muzzle the ox while it's treading out the grain. Where's that from? Deuteronomy, Old Testament. Then he says, well, I mentioned 2 pieces of Scripture. he says the worker deserves his wages. Where does that come from? Well, that's not an Old Testament passage. That's a New Testament passage from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 10. So he's quoting Luke's gospel as early as 63 AD and calling it scripture to somebody who should know if it is or isn't. Now, what's great about that is it appears that it'll be out there longer, right? It's probably been around for a while longer than that. That's why Timothy recognizes it as scripture. But how much earlier has it been out there? Well, I look at another book that no skeptic doubts came from Paul. Even Bart Ehrman, the famous biblical skeptic, would agree that this is a genuine Pauline document. And unfortunately, it's much earlier than 1 Timothy. It's at 53 to 57, where Paul is going to describe the Lord's Supper. And when he describes it, I first read it, I thought, that's interesting, because every gospel writer describes the Lord's Supper. The Lord's Supper is in every single gospel. But only one writer describes it the way that Paul does, saying that when Jesus did it, he said, drink this in remembrance of me. Well, where does that come from? Got any guesses? He is quoting Luke in chapter 22. So he's referring to Luke twice in his writing, and in one of these, he's writing as early as 53 to 57, and I think he's referencing the exact same thing that Luke is referencing. There's good reason to believe that Luke's gospel then has to predate this, and I would just put it, I won't predate it too much, I'll just put it at the exact same date. How's that, 53? Just to be safe. I think that's reasonable. Now, I remember when I first started examining the Gospels, I was struck by the claims of Mark. Who the heck is Mark? He's not an eyewitness. Why is he writing a gospel? Well, in the first century, a church leader named Papias wrote that Mark was chronicling the teaching of Peter. And Papias wrote that he wasn't trying to be all that careful about order. He was really trying to be more careful about accuracy. So it's not an orderly account, it's an accurate account, according to Papias in the first century. That was interesting to me because Luke, when he writes his gospel, he starts it off by saying that many have undertaken to drop an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. So Luke's not an eyewitness, he's a historian. Therefore, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, it seemed good to me also to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus. That's interesting. If you're writing an historical account, wouldn't I assume it's orderly? I think that Luke here is quite possibly referring to the disorderly account of Mark. His is now an orderly account. Who does he quote, by the way, more than anyone else in his gospel? Mark. So I have to place Mark ahead of Luke. I'm not going to place him a lot ahead of Luke, but a little bit, and that puts us very easily within the lifetime of the eyewitnesses. The early dating of the Gospels, I think, is actually the best inference from the circumstantial evidence. And if it's early, there are problems for those who are skeptical, because you've got to say to yourself, well, did it change over time? And it doesn't mean it's true. It just means it's written at least at the time that an eyewitness would have written it. By the way, why didn't they write it right away? Why did they wait 12, 15 years to write it? I'm thinking, why didn't they take notes and stick that thing on Facebook right away? That's what I would have done. Well, because I think that the apostles genuinely thought that Jesus would come back in their lifetime. And if that's the case, there's not much need, aside from orally. Let's get the information out quickly, because he's going to be back any day now. And then after they see people like Stephen and James being martyred, the brother of John, you start to see Gospels appear. Now it's time to start writing stuff down. We're not sure when he's coming back. Present, I think we can ask that. I have an entire 25, 30 minutes we could do just on verification, internal and external. So I'm just going to have to, we'll say it's in the book, but I love this aspect of using outside sources, internal corroboration of language and government and all kinds of references that the scriptures make.